With a foreclosure notice burning a hole in her purse and a real estate agent's promise of an incredible opportunity, interior designer Diana Blackthorne unknowingly purchased the one property in Ravenshollow that had been deliberately kept off the market for nearly 50 years. For beneath the estate's crumbling Georgian facade and wildly overgrown grounds lay evidence of a 1975 incident so devastating that an entire town had conspired to bury the truth, until Diana's restoration work unearthed what powerful families had spent decades ensuring would never see daylight. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story grips you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something even more shocking lined up for you. The November rain struck the windshield of Diana Blackthorne's aging Honda Civic with relentless fury as she navigated the winding road toward what would either be her salvation or her final mistake. Through the sheets of water cascading down her windshield, the imposing silhouette of Thornfield Estate emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of weathered stone and broken dreams that seemed to absorb what little gray light managed to penetrate the storm clouds above. At 31, Diana had built what she'd once considered a respectable interior design business in the historic district of Ravenshollow, Massachusetts. Her portfolio had included charming bed and breakfasts, boutique restaurants, and the occasional wealthy client's summer home renovation. She'd specialized in historic preservation with a modern twist, earning recognition from the Ravenshollow Historical Society and even a feature in New England Home magazine 3 years ago. Those had been good days, when her biggest worry was scheduling conflicts between eager clients. But respectable had transformed into struggling, and busy had become desperate over the past 18 months. The pandemic had decimated her client base almost overnight. The boutique hotels had closed, restaurants had shuttered, and wealthy homeowners had canceled renovation projects as the economy tanked. Diana had burned through her savings, keeping her small office space and paying her assistant, believing things would turn around quickly. They hadn't. The final blow had come last Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail in an envelope that felt as heavy as a death sentence. The foreclosure notice on her own Victorian cottage, the same cottage she'd lovingly restored as a showcase for her design skills, gave her 90 days to come up with $47,000 in back payments or lose everything she'd worked to build. Diana's hands had shaken as she'd read the legal terminology that would strip away not just her home, but her business reputation, her financial credibility, and the last connection she had to her grandmother who'd left her the cottage in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who'd made her career helping others create beautiful homes was about to lose her own. Which brought her to this moment, driving through a storm toward a property she'd purchased sight unseen, based on nothing more than a phone call and a leap of faith born from sheer desperation. The call had come from Marianne Whitmore, a real estate agent Diana had worked with occasionally on staging projects. Marianne's voice had carried an unusual urgency when she'd reached out 3 days ago, catching Diana as she sat in her empty office, staring at unpaid bills and calculating how long she could afford to keep the electricity on. "Diana, I have something that might interest you," Marianne had begun, her tone carefully modulated in the way that suggested she was choosing her words with unusual precision. "It's unconventional, but given your current situation—" She'd paused delicately, and Diana had realized with a mixture of embarrassment and resignation that her financial troubles were apparently common knowledge in Ravenshollow's tight-knit business community. "There's an estate property that's been in legal limbo for decades. The trust is finally liquidating, and they want it gone quickly, very quickly. No showings, no inspections, cash only, final sale. But Diana, the price—" She'd named a figure that was roughly 30% of what similar properties commanded in the area. Diana's logical mind immediately screamed warnings. Properties in Ravenshollow's exclusive Millionaires Row didn't sell for pennies on the dollar without serious underlying issues. The neighborhood was home to tech executives who'd cashed out of Boston startups, old New England money that traced back to shipping fortunes, and academics from nearby Whitmore University who'd written best-selling books or invented revolutionary technologies. Even distressed properties commanded premium prices due to the prestige of the address and the scarcity of available land. "What's wrong with it?" Diana asked, her professional skepticism warring with her desperate hope. "Nothing structurally," Marianne assured her quickly. "The trust has been maintaining it meticulously. It's just the circumstances of the sale are unusual. The previous owner died in 1975, and there's been some legal complexity about the estate. But that's all resolved now, and they want a quick, clean transaction." "Why me?" "Because you understand historic properties, because you have the vision to see potential where others see problems, and because—" She paused again. "Because you need this as much as the property needs you." The brutal honesty of that statement had cut through Diana's defenses. Marianne was right. Diana was drowning, and this mysterious property might be the life preserver she desperately needed. If she could flip it quickly, the profit could save her cottage, restart her business, and give her the financial breathing room to rebuild her client base. But there had been conditions that should have sent her running. The transaction had to be completed within 72 hours. No inspections meant no opportunity to discover hidden problems that could cost tens of thousands to fix. Cash only meant liquidating what remained of her 401k, borrowing against her business equipment, and convincing her elderly Aunt Margaret to co-sign a bridge loan that would put the old woman's own financial security at risk. It was financial suicide unless Diana could flip the property quickly and profitably. But with her cottage's foreclosure deadline looming, financial suicide seemed preferable to certain bankruptcy. So, she'd signed the papers in Marianne's office yesterday morning, transferred funds that represented every dollar she could scrape together, and received a single key along with an address: Thornfield Estate, 1247 Morning Dove Lane, Ravenshollow. Now, as the estate loomed before her through the rain, Diana wondered if desperation had finally pushed her over the edge into genuine madness. Thornfield Estate sat on nearly 3 acres at the end of Morning Dove Lane, a private road that dead-ended at the property's ornate but rusted iron gates. The gates stood open, as if welcoming visitors, but the effect was more ominous than inviting. Tall stone pillars flanked the entrance, each topped with carved ravens that seemed to watch her approach with malevolent interest. The main house was an imposing Georgian colonial, built sometime in the early 1900s according to the sparse records Marianne had provided. 3 stories of weathered gray stone rose from perfectly manicured grounds that showed no signs of the decades-long abandonment the property had allegedly endured. Ivy climbed the walls in controlled patterns that suggested regular maintenance, and the slate roof appeared to be in excellent condition despite its age. Previous owner? Dr. Edmund Ashford, deceased 1975. No living heirs. Property held in trust by the law firm of Whitmore, Blackwood and Associates until recent liquidation order. That was all Marianne had been able to provide. No history of the property's vacancy, no explanation for why such a substantial estate had mouldered away for nearly half a century while property values in the area skyrocketed. No details about Dr. Ashford or his connection to Ravenshallow's medical community. Diana parked her Honda in the circular driveway, noting immediately how the neighboring properties had been strategically landscaped to create natural barriers between themselves and Thornfield. The Morrison mansion to the east was hidden behind a wall of towering evergreen hedges that must have taken decades to grow to their current imposing height.
The Caldwell Estate to the west had positioned its main house to face completely away from Thornfield, and a stone wall ran along the shared property line. Even the road itself seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. Morning Dove Lane curved and narrowed as it approached the estate, creating the psychological impression of entering forbidden territory. No sidewalks, no street lighting, no mailboxes for other properties. Just a single road leading to a single destination that felt increasingly isolated from the civilized world with each passing mile. The front door key Marianne had provided turned easily in the ornate brass lock, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled and maintained, despite the property's apparently abandoned state. The heavy oak door swung open with only the slightest protest, and Diana stepped into what felt like a perfectly preserved time capsule. The interior was immaculate, not just clean, but meticulously maintained, as if someone had been caring for it with religious devotion for decades. Dust sheets covered furniture that was still arranged exactly as it might have been during the estate's final occupied days. A newspaper on the front hall table bore the date October 15, 1975. Its page is yellow with age, but completely readable. The headline read, "Local Doctor Receives Federal Research Grant." Diana pulled out her iPhone to document the property's condition for insurance purposes, but found no signal whatsoever. The estate's thick stone walls and remote location had created a communication dead zone. She was completely cut off from the outside world. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. This level of preservation was unprecedented in Diana's professional experience. She'd worked on dozens of historic properties, including several that had been vacant for extended periods. Vacant properties deteriorated rapidly in New England's harsh climate. Roofs leaked, pipes froze and burst, insects and rodents moved in, foundation settling caused cracks, and decay was inevitable without constant human intervention. Yet Thornfield Estate showed none of these typical signs of abandonment. The hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polish, the windows were spotless, and even the period wallpaper appeared to be in mint condition. The brass fixtures shone, the crystal chandelier hanging in the foyer was free of dust, and the Persian rugs scattered throughout the entrance hall looked like they'd been professionally cleaned recently. Someone had been maintaining this property with extraordinary care for 50 years. But why? And on whose authority? As Diana moved through the grand foyer into what appeared to be a formal living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her. Family portraits lined the walls, stern-faced Victorians and Edwardians, whose eyes seemed to track her movement through the room. The furniture, though covered with protective sheets, suggested substantial wealth. The distinctive curves of hand-carved mahogany pieces, the glint of crystal and silver underneath careful wrapping. Persian rugs that would be worth small fortunes at auction.
The formal dining room told a similar story of carefully preserved luxury. A massive table dominated the space, set for 12 with china that bore an elaborate family crest. Silver serving pieces sat in precise arrangements, as if a formal dinner party had been planned but never executed. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 11:47, and Diana found herself wondering if that had been the exact moment when life in this house had ended. The kitchen revealed the first disturbing anachronisms. Modern appliances from the 1970s sat alongside period pieces from earlier decades, but everything had been left as if the residents had simply stepped out for an afternoon and never returned. A coffee cup sat beside the sink, still bearing the ghost of lipstick marks on the rim. A calendar on the wall showed October 20th, 1975, with several dates circled in red ink, October 20th through October 31st. Whatever had happened at Thornfield Estate had occurred during those circled dates in late October 1975. Diana's trained eye began cataloging the renovation work that would be required, though she was beginning to suspect that the property's value lay more in its preservation than in any improvements she might make. The bones of the house were magnificent. Soaring ceilings that rose nearly 12 feet on the main floor, original crown molding carved with intricate detail that would cost a fortune to replicate today. Hand-carved banisters that spiraled up a grand staircase with the fluid grace of master craftsmanship. But there were oddities that troubled her professional sensibilities. Certain rooms had been modified in ways that didn't make architectural sense. Doorways had been sealed and reopened in different locations, creating awkward traffic patterns that disrupted the home's original flow. Windows had been blocked with stone blocks that matched the exterior walls so perfectly they appeared original, but the interior proportions suggested they were later additions. Most puzzling were the rooms that seemed to serve no clear purpose, spaces that were too large for storage but too small for comfortable living, equipped with electrical outlets and lighting fixtures but no obvious function. It was as if the house had been systematically altered to accommodate activities that required privacy and isolation. In what had once been a library, Diana discovered something that made her pulse quicken with both professional excitement and growing unease. The room contained floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with medical journals, psychology texts, and research papers that spanned several decades. But one entire section of built-in bookcases didn't align properly with the room's proportions. The discrepancy was subtle, the kind of detail only someone with Diana's trained eye for spatial relationships would notice. The bookcase in question was roughly 8 feet wide, but the space it occupied appeared to be closer to 10 feet. The missing 2 feet created an asymmetry that violated the room's otherwise perfect Georgian proportions. Diana had seen similar discrepancies in historic homes where rooms had been subdivided or where original architectural features had been concealed for various reasons. Examining the bookcase more closely, Diana found what appeared to be a small brass mechanism hidden behind a leather-bound volume titled Advances in Behavioral Psychology, 1973. When she pressed it, a section of the bookcase swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness below the house's main foundation. Diana's heart hammered as she peered into the hidden passage. The air that wafted upward carried scents that made her skin crawl. A mixture of chemical preservatives, old paper, and something organic that had been sealed away for decades. It was the smell of secrets that had been buried too long. Secret rooms weren't uncommon in houses of this vintage. She'd discovered several during her career. Prohibition-era hiding spots where wealthy families had stored illegal alcohol, servants' passages that allowed staff to move through houses without disturbing the owners, were simply architectural quirks born from the eccentric preferences of original builders. But this staircase descended much deeper than would be necessary for a wine cellar or storage area. Diana counted at least 20 steps before the passage disappeared into complete darkness, suggesting a substantial underground space that extended well beyond the house's foundation. Every instinct screamed at her to close the passage and pretend she'd never found it. Diana had watched enough horror movies to know that curious protagonists who investigated mysterious hidden chambers rarely emerged unscathed. But she was also a professional who needed to understand exactly what she'd purchased. If the property had structural issues, historical complications, or hidden features that could affect its value or legal status, she needed to know immediately. Her financial survival depended on her ability to accurately assess and quickly flip this property. Hidden chambers could either be valuable selling points — wealthy buyers loved historic properties with secret passages — or massive liabilities if they contained environmental hazards, structural problems, or legal complications. Diana retrieved a flashlight from her car and steeled herself for what she might find below. The autumn storm was intensifying, and she wanted to complete her initial property assessment before the weather made driving dangerous.
The staircase was constructed from the same stone as the house's foundation, with handholds carved directly into the walls for safety. Whomever had built this passage had intended it to be permanent and frequently used. The steps were worn smooth in the center, suggesting decades of regular traffic. 23 steps down, Diana counted each one. She emerged into a large underground chamber that defied every assumption she'd had about the property. The space was enormous, roughly 30 feet square, with a ceiling that rose nearly 10 feet above her head. It wasn't a basement or root cellar. It was a purpose-built facility that had been constructed with the same attention to detail and quality materials as the house above. The walls were lined with the same stone as the foundation, but they'd been sealed and painted to create a sterile, clinical environment. Fluorescent lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, and when Diana located the wall switches, they flickered to life with the steady hum of ballasts that had been maintained in working order. The lights revealed a space that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The chamber was part laboratory, part medical facility, part office complex. Stainless steel examination tables lined the walls, accompanied by equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything she would have expected from 1975. Centrifuges, microscopes, what appeared to be early computer terminals, and devices whose purposes she couldn't even guess at. Some of the equipment bore manufacturer labels from companies she recognized: IBM, General Electric, Westinghouse. But the models were unlike anything she'd seen in medical facilities. Filing cabinets covered every available wall space, their metal surfaces reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. In the center of the room sat a large oak desk that perfectly matched the furniture upstairs, its surface covered with papers, charts, and what appeared to be detailed medical records. But it was the photographs covering an entire wall that made Diana's legs weak and her stomach lurch with horror. Dozens upon dozens of black and white photographs showed children, some playing in what appeared to be hospital playrooms, others sleeping in clinical beds with monitoring equipment attached to their heads, still others displaying expressions of confusion, fear, or drugged placidity that no child should ever wear. Each photograph was labeled with meticulous notation, dates ranging from 1973 through 1975, and clinical observations written in a cramped, precise handwriting. Subject 7, Cognitive Enhancement Trial, Day 14. Notable improvement in pattern recognition. Side effects minimal. Subject 23, Behavioral Modification Protocol, Session 31. Subject shows decreased aggression, increased compliance. Memory suppression successful. Subject 31, Memory Alteration Experiment, Phase 3. Previous identity markers successfully suppressed, integration proceeding as planned. Diana's hands shook as she pulled file after file from the cabinets, each one documenting what appeared to be systematic, unauthorized human experimentation on children. Dr. Edmund Ashford hadn't just been any physician. He'd been conducting sophisticated psychological and neurological experiments on minors, using his position as chief psychiatrist at Ravenshollow Children's Hospital to recruit unwilling subjects from vulnerable families. The documentation was horrifyingly thorough and professionally organized. Intake forms showed children admitted for routine behavioral issues, ADHD, mild learning disabilities, adjustment disorders following family trauma or divorce. Parents had signed consent forms for what they believed was standard psychiatric treatment for their troubled children. But once in Dr. Ashford's care, these children had become unwilling test subjects for experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics beyond recognition. Memory modification techniques, behavioral conditioning protocols, cognitive enhancement experiments, pharmaceutical trials using drugs that wouldn't be approved for human testing for decades. The files revealed a systematic program designed to determine whether children's personalities, memories, and cognitive abilities could be artificially altered. Some experiments appeared to focus on enhancing intelligence or eliminating behavioral problems. Others seemed designed to test the limits of human psychological manipulation. Most disturbing were the files labeled Integration Protocol, detailed procedures for returning experimentally modified children to their families without detection. The protocols included elaborate cover stories, fake medical histories, and techniques for ensuring that parents wouldn't notice the fundamental changes in their children's personalities and capabilities. A manila folder labeled Final Protocols, October 1975, contained correspondence that made Diana's hands shake so violently she could barely hold the papers. Letters between Dr. Ashford and several names she recognized from Ravenshollow's history. Mayor Harrison Blackwood from that era, the hospital board chairman, prominent business leaders, and most disturbingly, Robert Whittemore, the father of Marianne, the real estate agent who had sold her this property. The correspondence revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond one rogue doctor. Ravenshollow's power structure had not only known about the experiments, they had actively supported and funded them. The program had been presented as cutting-edge research that would position Ravenshollow as a leader in psychiatric medicine and potentially generate substantial revenue through pharmaceutical partnerships. But something had gone wrong in October 1975. The final documents in the folder revealed a crisis that had forced the immediate termination of all research activities. A typewritten memo dated October 31, 1975, bore Dr. Ashford's letterhead.
Experimental program concluded as of this date due to unforeseen complications. All subjects processed according to emergency termination protocols. Facility to be sealed indefinitely pending review. Town Council unanimous agreement. Property remains undisturbed pending full investigation and containment verification. RW designated as long-term monitor. Public inquiry to be discouraged through all available channels. Evidence secured pending further instructions. Diana staggered backward, the implications crashing over her like a physical weight. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was the scene of systematic child abuse that had been deliberately concealed by Ravenshollow's power structure for 50 years. And somehow, Marianne Whittemore had manipulated her into purchasing the evidence. But what had happened to the children? The files showed 43 subjects over the 2-year period, ranging in age from 6 to 16. There were detailed intake records for each child, exhaustive documentation of experimental procedures, but virtually no discharge records, no follow-up notes, no indication of where these children had gone when the program was concluded according to emergency termination protocols. As Diana turned to leave the chamber, her flashlight beam swept across something that made her stomach heave and her vision blur with horror. A small alcove she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a partition near the back wall of the laboratory. The alcove contained a neat pile of children's personal belongings, shoes in various sizes, from tiny sneakers that might have belonged to a 6-year-old to teenage boots. Stuffed animals showing signs of being deeply loved and frequently held. Small toys, action figures, dolls, toy cars. A few items of clothing, including a small pink sweater with Jenny embroidered on the front. All of these items were arranged with the same meticulous care as everything else in the facility, as if they were museum pieces being preserved for posterity. But the children who owned these treasured possessions were nowhere to be found. Diana's mind recoiled from the obvious implications. 43 children had entered this facility. There were no discharge records, and their personal belongings remained here, carefully preserved like memorial artifacts. The emergency termination protocols hadn't returned the children to their families. They had eliminated the evidence, all of it. Diana raced up the stairs, her mind reeling with horror and disbelief. She needed to get out of here immediately, call the police, contact the FBI, expose this monstrous cover-up that had been hidden for nearly 50 years. But as she reached the library and began to close the hidden passage, she heard the sound that turned her blood to ice, car doors slamming outside the house.
Through the library's tall windows, Diana could see 3 black Mercedes SUVs parked in the estate's circular driveway, their tinted windows reflecting the gray afternoon light like dead eyes. Their occupants were emerging with the purposeful movements of people who knew exactly why they were there and exactly what they intended to accomplish. They knew she was here. They knew what she'd found, and they were coming to ensure that the secret of Thornfield Estate remained buried just as it had been for the past 50 years. Diana's phone still showed no signal, the estate's isolation working against her in ways she was only now beginning to understand. She was trapped in a house that held evidence of unspeakable crimes, surrounded by the very people who had spent decades keeping those crimes hidden. As footsteps approached the front door and she heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in the lock, a key that Robert Whitmore apparently possessed, Diana realized that her desperate gamble to save her failing business had led her into something far more dangerous than bankruptcy. She had stumbled into a conspiracy that powerful people had killed to protect, and now she was the only witness to crimes that officially never happened. The front door opened, and Diana heard Robert Whitmore's cultured voice echoing through the grand foyer. "Miss Blackthorne, we know you're here. We need to have a conversation." Diana's heart hammered against her ribs as Robert Whitmore's voice echoed through the estate's grand foyer. She pressed herself against the library wall, mind racing through impossible options.
Her phone remained useless, the estate's isolation now feeling less like a quirk of geography and more like a carefully engineered trap. But Diana's professional experience had taught her that old houses always offered multiple escape routes, servants' stairs, back entrances, delivery passages designed to keep staff movements invisible to the main household. Moving as quietly as possible, Diana slipped behind the library's massive desk and found what she'd hoped for: a second door, partially concealed behind floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The brass handle turned silently, revealing a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway. The servants' passage was dimly lit by small windows that faced the estate's rear grounds. Diana could see dense woods extending beyond the manicured lawn. If she could reach the tree line, she might be able to circle back to her car or find another way to call for help. As she moved through the passage, Diana's mind churned over the implications of what she'd discovered. The underground laboratory wasn't just evidence of past crimes. It was proof of an ongoing conspiracy that reached into Ravenshallow's current power structure. Robert Whitmore hadn't simply inherited knowledge of his father's involvement, he'd actively maintained the cover-up for decades. The passage ended at a service entrance near the estate's kitchen. Through the small window, Diana could see that the rear grounds were empty. Whitmore's men had focused their initial search on the main house. But her Honda was parked in the front drive, surrounded by their vehicles. Diana eased the service door open and slipped outside into the cold November air. The storm was intensifying, providing natural cover as she moved along the estate's perimeter toward the woods. Her professional clothes, a wool blazer and dress pants, were wholly inadequate for outdoor escape, but desperation provided its own insulation against the cold. Behind her, she could hear voices calling her name from inside the house. They discovered her absence and would begin expanding their search momentarily. Diana reached the tree line just as flashlight beams began sweeping the rear grounds. The woods were dense and unforgiving, full of hidden roots and low branches that caught at her clothing. But they also offered concealment and, she hoped, an alternative route back to the main road. Diana had noticed during her drive that Morning Dove Lane curved around a substantial wooded area. If she could navigate through the trees, she might emerge at a point where she could flag down passing traffic. As she stumbled through the underbrush, Diana's mind raced over what she'd learned. 43 children had disappeared into Dr. Ashford's facility between 1973 and 1975. Their personal belongings remained in that underground chamber like memorial artifacts, and Ravenshollow's power structure had not only covered up these crimes, but had actively profited from maintaining the conspiracy.
The real estate transaction that had seemed like her salvation was actually an elaborate trap. Marianne Whitmore had specifically targeted Diana because of her financial desperation, knowing that a struggling business owner would be willing to overlook the unusual terms of sale. They'd needed someone to purchase the property legitimately, probably to satisfy legal requirements for the trust's liquidation, but they'd also needed to control what that person discovered. The question was whether they'd planned to simply buy her silence or if they'd intended something more permanent from the beginning. Diana had been walking for nearly 20 minutes when she heard the sound that chilled her to the bone. Dogs barking. Not the playful yapping of family pets, but the deep, purposeful baying of hunting dogs following a scent trail. They hadn't just come prepared to intimidate her into silence. They'd come equipped to hunt her down if she ran. Panic gave Diana a speed she didn't know she possessed. She crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about stealth, focused only on reaching the road before the dogs found her trail. Behind her, the barking grew louder and more excited as the animals picked up her scent. The trees began to thin, and Diana could see the gray ribbon of asphalt through the branches. But as she emerged from the woods onto Morning Dove Lane, her heart sank. 2 more black SUVs were parked along the road, their occupants clearly positioned to intercept anyone attempting to flee the estate. Diana was completely surrounded. She ducked back into the tree line, mind racing through increasingly desperate options. The dogs were closer now, their handlers' voices carrying through the storm. In minutes, they would have her cornered with nowhere left to run. That's when Diana noticed something she'd missed during her panicked flight. The woods weren't as isolated as they appeared. Through the trees, she could see the lights of a house, not one of the massive estates on Millionaire's Row, but a modest cottage that seemed to belong to a different era of Ravenshallow's development. The cottage was her only hope. Diana fought her way through the remaining trees toward the distant lights, thorns tearing at her clothes and branches whipping across her face. The dogs were close enough now that she could hear their panting between barks. Her professional high heels had long since become a liability. She kicked them off and continued barefoot across the frozen ground. The cottage's backyard was separated from the woods by a low stone wall that Diana scaled with desperation-fueled agility. She pounded on the back door, praying that whoever lived here would be willing to help a stranger in obvious distress.
The door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a cardigan and holding a steaming mug of tea. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern as she took in Diana's disheveled appearance. "My dear, what on earth?" "Please," Diana gasped, "I need to call the police. There are men chasing me with dogs. I'm in serious danger." The elderly woman's eyes sharpened with intelligence and understanding that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had arrived at her door fleeing trouble from the direction of Thornfield Estate. "Come in quickly," she said, pulling Diana inside and immediately locking the door behind her. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell, and I've been waiting nearly 50 years for someone to discover what's hidden in that accursed place." Diana stared at the woman in shock. "You know about the estate? About what happened there?" Eleanor guided Diana to a chair by the kitchen fire and handed her a warm towel. "I know more than I've ever been allowed to say. My late husband, Dr. James Hartwell, was Edmund Ashford's colleague at Ravenshollow Children's Hospital. He tried to stop what was happening. It cost him his career and nearly cost us our lives." "The children," Diana whispered. "The 43 children in the files. What happened to them?" Eleanor's face crumpled with grief that had been carried for decades. James tried to expose the program in October 1975. He gathered evidence, documented the abuse, prepared to go to federal authorities, but Ashford and his conspirators moved faster than we anticipated. She moved to a kitchen drawer and withdrew a manila folder, its edges worn with age. James managed to smuggle out copies of some records before they destroyed everything. "We've kept them,"
all these years, waiting for the right moment, the right person who might be able to bring justice. Diana opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photocopied documents that filled in the horrifying gaps from the underground laboratory. Medical records showing systematic drugging of children with experimental compounds. Psychological evaluation forms documenting personality changes and memory alterations. And most damning of all, a series of death certificates for children who had supposedly died in accidents or from sudden illnesses during the exact period when Dr. Ashford's program was operational. "They killed them," Diana breathed, the full scope of the horror finally becoming clear. All 43 children. They murdered them when the program was shut down. "Not immediately," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with survivor's guilt. "James's investigation forced them to act quickly. Some children were returned to their families, but they'd been so fundamentally altered by the experiments that they were essentially different people wearing familiar faces. Others were relocated to facilities out of state, their identities completely erased." She pointed to a specific document in the folder. But the children who had been subjected to the most extreme procedures, the ones who could never be safely returned to society, they were eliminated according to what the files called humanitarian protocols. Diana felt sick as the euphemistic language revealed its true meaning. Humanitarian protocols meant murder dressed up in clinical terminology. "Why didn't you go to the authorities with this evidence?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "We tried, but the conspiracy reached into every level of Ravenshallow's power structure. The police chief, the mayor, the hospital administration, prominent business leaders, even state representatives. They were all either directly involved or financially dependent on the families that were involved." She moved to the window and peered through the curtains. In the distance, flashlight beams were sweeping through the woods. "They're here. They followed my trail." Eleanor moved with surprising speed for her age, leading Diana through her cottage to what appeared to be a coat closet. But when she pressed against the back wall, it swung open to reveal a hidden room. James was paranoid about our safety after his investigation was shut down. He modified the cottage to include several hiding places. This one connects to an old root cellar that leads to a tunnel system from Prohibition days. The hidden room was small but well supplied with water, emergency food, and communication equipment, including a modern cell phone with external antenna connections that bypassed the estate's interference.
"You can call for help from here," Eleanor said, handing Diana the phone. "But be careful who you trust. The Whitmore family has maintained influence in law enforcement for decades." Diana's hands shook as she dialed 911, but the call connected immediately. When the dispatcher answered, Diana forced herself to speak calmly and clearly. "This is Diana Blackthorne. I need to report the discovery of evidence related to multiple homicides dating from 1975, and I'm currently being pursued by armed men who want to prevent me from reporting these crimes. I'm at..." She looked questioningly at Eleanor. "47 Woodland Court, Ravenshollow," Eleanor whispered. Diana relayed the address and requested immediate police response, emphasizing that she had physical evidence of systematic child murder and that current city officials were involved in the ongoing cover-up. The dispatcher assured her that units were being dispatched immediately, but Diana knew that response time to this remote area could be 20 minutes or more. Through the hidden room's ventilation system, she could hear voices outside Eleanor's cottage as the search party reached the property. "Mrs. Hartwell," a cultured voice called from outside. Diana recognized Robert Whitmore's tone even through the walls. "We know you're harboring our visitor. This doesn't need to become complicated for you." Eleanor's face hardened with decades of suppressed anger.
That man was a child when his father helped orchestrate those murders. He grew up knowing exactly what his family had done, and he chose to perpetuate the cover-up rather than seek justice. How do you know so much about the Whitmore family's involvement? Because James documented everything. Every meeting, every threat, every financial transaction that kept the conspiracy hidden. The evidence I've preserved doesn't just prove the original crimes, it proves 50 years of ongoing criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice. Diana examined the additional documents Eleanor had provided. Bank records showing payments from a trust fund to local officials, property records documenting how the estate had been managed to prevent discovery, and correspondence between conspirators discussing how to handle periodic threats to their secret. Most damning were the photographs James Hartwell had taken during his investigation. Images of the underground laboratory while it was still operational, showing children in various stages of the experimental process. The photos were horrific but irrefutable proof that the documented crimes had actually occurred. "Mrs. Hartwell," Whitmore's voice came again, closer to the cottage now. "We know you're harboring our visitor. This doesn't need to become complicated for you." "Let them search," Eleanor whispered. "This room was designed to be undetectable. James was an engineer before he became a doctor. He built this hiding place to specifications that would fool professional investigators." But Diana could hear footsteps inside the cottage now. Either Eleanor had forgotten to lock the front door, or the search party had come prepared to bypass normal security measures. "The police will be here soon," Diana said, as much to reassure herself as Eleanor. "Not soon enough," Eleanor replied grimly. "And when they arrive, you need to be very careful about which officers you trust. The Ravenshollow Police Department has been compromised since the 1970s. The search sounds were getting closer. Diana could hear furniture being moved, doors being opened, voices coordinating the systematic examination of Eleanor's cottage. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the hidden room, regardless of how well it had been concealed. "There's something else you need to know," Eleanor urgently said. "The estate isn't the only location where crimes occurred. Dr. Ashford had additional facilities, places where children were held before being brought to Thornfield, places where bodies were disposed of afterward." She pulled out a hand-drawn map from the document folder. James identified at least 3 other properties in the area that were connected to the program. "If you survive to expose this conspiracy, those locations will also need to be investigated." Diana studied the map, recognizing several addresses from Ravenshallow's most exclusive neighborhoods. The conspiracy hadn't been limited to a single rogue doctor and a few corrupt officials. It was a systematic network involving multiple properties and dozens of participants. "How many people were involved?" Diana asked. James estimated at least 30 adults had direct knowledge of the crimes, with perhaps twice that number involved in the cover-up afterward. This wasn't just child abuse, it was an organized criminal enterprise that generated substantial profits for its participants. Profits from what? Eleanor's expression grew even grimmer. Dr. Ashford wasn't conducting random experiments. He was developing techniques and pharmaceutical protocols that were sold to government agencies and private corporations. The children weren't just victims, they were products in a research and development program. The implications hit Diana like a physical blow. The murdered children hadn't just been casualties of one doctor's twisted research. They'd been deliberately sacrificed to generate intellectual property that had enriched their killers for decades. The patents, the pharmaceutical formulations, the behavioral modification techniques, they're still being used today. Companies around the world have built billion-dollar industries on research that cost 43 children their lives. Diana thought about the sophisticated equipment she'd seen in the underground laboratory, technology that had seemed far too advanced for 1975. They weren't just experimenting. They were running a business. Exactly. And that business model requires absolute secrecy, which is why they're so desperate to silence you now.
The sounds of searching had moved closer. Diana could hear voices just outside the closet where their hidden room was concealed. Any moment now, the searchers would discover the mechanism that opened the concealed door. "If they find us," Eleanor said quietly, "remember that the evidence must survive, even if we don't. James built multiple copies of everything and hid them in different locations. Even if they destroy what's here, other copies exist." "Where?" Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "Places they'll never think to look. Places that will ensure the truth comes out no matter what happens to us tonight." Before Diana could ask for more details, she heard the sound that made her blood freeze. The distinctive click of the hidden room's locking mechanism being triggered from outside. Someone had found the concealed door. Light flooded their hiding place as the wall swung open, revealing Robert Whitmore, flanked by two younger men whose builds and bearing suggested they were accustomed to violence. Whitmore's expression was calm, almost sympathetic, as if he regretted the necessity of what was about to happen. "Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Blackthorne," he said politely, "I think it's time we had that conversation." Diana clutched the evidence folder to her chest, knowing that it might be the only thing standing between her and the same fate that had befallen 43 children 50 years ago. But she also knew that Eleanor had been right about one thing. The truth had to survive, even if they didn't. The game of cat and mouse at Thornfield Estate had ended. Now the real test would begin. Whether justice, delayed for 50 years, could finally be served, or whether Ravenshallow's darkest secret would claim 2 more victims in its ongoing cover-up. As messengers stepped forward to escort them from the hidden room, Diana heard the sound she'd been praying for. Sirens in the distance, growing louder as police units responded to her emergency call. But she also saw Whitmore's confident smile, and realized that he wasn't concerned about the approaching authorities, which meant that either he controlled them or he had no intention of letting Diana and Eleanor live long enough to speak with them. The next few minutes would determine whether the truth about Thornfield Estate would finally see daylight or whether it would be buried along with 2 more inconvenient witnesses to Ravenshallow's most carefully guarded secret. The sirens grew louder as police units approached Eleanor's cottage, but Robert Whitmore's expression remained unnaturally calm. Diana clutched the evidence folder against her chest, her mind racing through the implications of his confidence. Either he controlled the responding officers, or he had a plan that made their arrival irrelevant. "Gentlemen," Whitmore said to his associates, "please escort Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Blackthorne to the living room. We'll wait for our colleagues from the police department to arrive." The careful phrasing sent a chill through Diana. Not the police, but our colleagues from the police department. The corruption Eleanor had warned about wasn't historical. It was active and ongoing. As they were led from the hidden room, Diana caught Eleanor's eye and saw the older woman's almost imperceptible nod toward a bookshelf near the cottage's front window. Following her gaze, Diana noticed that one volume, a thick atlas, protruded slightly from the others. Eleanor was trying to tell her something about additional evidence, but Diana couldn't understand the signal. The first police cruiser arrived within minutes, followed quickly by 2 more. Diana's heart sank as she recognized the lead officer emerging from the first vehicle, Chief Marcus Aldridge, a man whose campaign for sheriff had been heavily funded by Ravenshallow's business community. If Whitmore had influence with law enforcement, Aldridge would be exactly the wrong person to trust with their lives. "Chief Aldridge," Whitmore greeted warmly as the officers entered Eleanor's cottage, "we have a situation that requires delicate handling."
The heavy-set man in his 50s, whose uniform strained against his substantial frame, assessed the scene with the calculating look of someone accustomed to making problems disappear rather than solving them. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Blackthorne here has been trespassing on private property and making wild accusations based on documents of questionable authenticity. Mrs. Hartwell, unfortunately, appears to be feeding these delusions with materials related to her late husband's psychiatric difficulties." I felt my blood pressure spike with outrage. Those documents prove systematic child murder. 43 children were killed at Thornfield Estate between 1973 and 1975, and there's been a conspiracy to cover it up ever since. "That's quite an accusation, miss. Do you have any evidence to support these claims?"
"I'm afraid Miss Blackthorne has been under considerable stress," Whitmore interrupted smoothly. "Her business is failing, she's facing foreclosure, and she recently made an impulsive property purchase that's left her financially desperate. Mrs. Hartwell, sadly, has a history of supporting conspiracy theories related to her husband's unfortunate mental breakdown in the 1970s. Diana stared at him in disbelief. Whitmore was rewriting reality in real time, transforming documented evidence of mass murder into the delusions of unstable women. Worse, Chief Aldrich seemed completely prepared to accept this narrative without examination. "Chief," Diana said desperately, "I can show you the underground laboratory. There's a hidden passage in the Thornfield Estate library that leads to a fully equipped medical facility where children were experimented on and killed. The evidence is still there, preserved exactly as it was left in 1975. "Miss Blackthorne," Aldrich replied with practiced patience, "breaking and entering is a serious crime. If you've been trespassing on Mr. Whitmore's family property and disturbing what you believe to be evidence, you could be facing multiple felony charges." "It's my property," Diana protested. "I purchased it legally 3 days ago." Whitmore produced a document from his jacket. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about the ownership situation. The sale Miss Blackthorne refers to was conditional upon inspection and approval by the trust administrators. Since those conditions weren't met, the transaction has been voided." Diana's world tilted as she realized the full scope of their manipulation. The property purchase that had seemed like her salvation was actually another layer of the trap. They'd never intended for her to actually own Thornfield Estate. They'd simply needed her to discover what was hidden there so they could assess whether their secret remained secure. "You can't just void a legal sale," Diana said, though she was beginning to suspect they could do exactly that if they controlled enough of the legal system. "Real estate transactions involving historic properties have complex regulatory requirements. Miss Blackthorne's purchase failed to meet several mandatory conditions. The trust's attorneys are already processing the cancellation paperwork." Eleanor, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Chief Aldrich, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father was a good man who believed in justice. Are you really going to participate in covering up child murder?" Aldrich's expression flickered with something that might have been shame, but his response was professionally neutral. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you've been through trauma related to your husband's situation, but making accusations about respected community members based on old grievances isn't helpful to anyone." "Old grievances?" Eleanor's voice rose with indignation. "My husband tried to save children who were being tortured and killed. The respected community members you're protecting are the people who destroyed his career and threatened our lives to keep their crimes hidden." Diana watched this exchange with growing despair. The evidence folder in her hands contained irrefutable proof of horrific crimes, but it was becoming clear that the truth was irrelevant if the entire system was designed to suppress it. That's when she noticed something that gave her the first glimmer of hope since this nightmare began.
Officer Sarah Chen, one of the younger officers who had arrived with Chief Aldrich, was paying careful attention to Eleanor's words. Unlike her colleagues, Chen's expression showed genuine concern rather than dismissive skepticism. Chen was also positioned near the bookshelf Eleanor had indicated earlier, and Diana saw her glance toward the protruding atlas with recognition. Somehow, Officer Chen was connected to this situation in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "Chief," Diana said directly, "I'm willing to provide you with complete access to the evidence I've gathered, and I can show you exactly where the underground laboratory is located. All I'm asking for is a real investigation, not a predetermined dismissal." Chen looked to Chief Aldrich for guidance, but her body language suggested she was prepared to act independently if necessary. "Chief, I think we should at least examine the documents Miss Blackthorne has collected. If they're fabricated or unreliable, that will be obvious upon inspection."
"The documents have already been examined by qualified experts," Whitmore said. "They've been determined to be either forgeries or materials taken out of context to support predetermined conclusions." "What experts?" Diana demanded. "When were they examined? By whom?" Whitmore's slight pause before answering told Diana that he was improvising. "The Trust's legal team has been aware of these allegations for years. Mrs. Hartwell has attempted to promote this conspiracy theory on multiple occasions, and each time, qualified professionals have debunked her claims." Eleanor stood up with surprising strength for her age. "That's a lie, and you know it. James's evidence has never been examined by anyone because we've been too afraid to share it until now. But I'm not afraid anymore." She moved toward the bookshelf Diana had noticed earlier and pulled out the protruding atlas. As she opened it, Diana saw that it had been hollowed out to create a hiding place containing a small recording device. "James wasn't just paranoid about our safety," Eleanor said, activating the device. "He was methodical about documentation. This recorder has been running continuously since you entered my cottage, Mr. Whitmore. Every threat, every admission, every detail of your cover-up has been captured." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Whitmore's composed facade cracked for the first time, revealing the calculating predator beneath the cultured exterior. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said carefully, "I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of our conversation. We're simply trying to help Miss Blackthorne resolve her legal difficulties regarding the property purchase." "The recorder doesn't lie," Eleanor replied, "unlike you." Officer Chen stepped forward with renewed authority. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'd like to take custody of that recording device as evidence, and I'd like to examine the documents Miss Blackthorne has collected." Chief Aldrich moved to block Chen's access to Eleanor. "Officer Chen, you're overstepping your authority. This situation is being handled through appropriate administrative channels." "Sir, with respect, if we have potential evidence of multiple homicides, administrative channels aren't sufficient. We need to secure the evidence and begin a proper criminal investigation." Diana realized that Officer Chen was either extraordinarily brave or had some form of protection that made her willing to challenge both Chief Aldrich and the Whitmore family. Either way, she represented Diana's best hope for survival. "Officer Chen," Diana said, "there's something else you need to know. The underground laboratory at Thornfield Estate isn't just historical evidence, it's been maintained in operational condition for 50 years. Someone has been preserving it as if they intended to use it again." This revelation clearly shocked even Eleanor, who turned to stare at Diana with horror. "Maintained? You mean the equipment is still functional?" "Everything. The lights work, the examination tables are clean, the filing cabinets are organized. Someone has been caring for that facility as if it were an active medical practice." Whitmore's mask slipped completely. "That's enough," he said coldly. "Officer Chen, I think you will find that your continued employment with the Ravenshollow Police Department depends on your ability to recognize when situations require discretion rather than aggressive investigation." "Are you threatening a police officer, Mr. Whitmore?"
Chen asked, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. "I'm reminding everyone present that some secrets exist for good reasons, and that disturbing those secrets can have consequences for entire communities." Diana felt the temperature in the room drop as Whitmore's true nature emerged. This wasn't just about covering up historical crimes. There were ongoing activities that required the same level of secrecy. "Officer Chen," Diana said urgently, "the maintenance of that laboratory suggests that whatever happened in the 1970s might still be happening. There could be children at risk right now." Chen's expression hardened with determination. "Chief Aldrich, I'm formally requesting backup and a search warrant for the Thornfield Estate. If there's any possibility that children are currently in danger, we have an obligation to investigate immediately." "Denied," Aldrich said flatly. "Officer Chen, you're suspended pending an internal review of your conduct tonight. You can't suspend me for requesting a proper investigation of potential child endangerment. I can suspend you for insubordination and failure to follow proper chain of command." Diana watched this confrontation with growing alarm. Officer Chen was her only ally within law enforcement, and Aldrich was systematically eliminating her ability to help. That's when Eleanor made a decision that changed everything. "Officer Chen," Eleanor said loudly, "I'm formally requesting protective custody. I have reason to believe that my life is in immediate danger from individuals connected to the crimes I've been documenting." It was a brilliant tactical move. By requesting protective custody, Eleanor was forcing the police department to either provide protection or explain why they were refusing to protect a citizen who claimed to be threatened. "Mrs. Hartwell," Chief Aldrich said carefully, "protective custody requires specific, credible threats. General fears about old grievances don't meet the legal standard. Mr. Whitmore just threatened Officer Chen's employment for investigating potential child murder. If he's willing to intimidate law enforcement, what do you think he's willing to do to civilian witnesses?"
Diana realized that Eleanor was creating an official record of the threats and intimidation. Even if they didn't survive the night, there would be documentation of what had happened and who was responsible. "I also request protective custody," Diana added. "I've discovered evidence of systematic child murder, and the people responsible have been hunting me with dogs through the woods. I have reasonable fear for my safety." Officer Chen looked between Diana, Eleanor, and Chief Aldrich with growing understanding. "Chief, we have 2 citizens requesting protective custody based on credible threats related to potential ongoing crimes. Department policy requires us to provide protection pending investigation. Officer Chen, you're suspended. You have no authority to make policy determinations." "Then you make the determination, Chief. Will the Ravenshollow Police Department protect these women or not?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Chief Aldrich was being forced to take an official position that would be recorded and reviewed. If he refused protection and something happened to Diana and Eleanor, his career would be over. If he provided protection, it would legitimize their claims and force a real investigation. Whitmore stepped forward to break the standoff. "Perhaps we can resolve this situation more amicably. Ms. Blackthorne, Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you're concerned about historical events. The Whitmore family would be willing to fund a proper historical commission to examine these allegations through appropriate academic channels." Diana recognized the offer as another attempt at control. A historical commission funded by the Whitmore family would reach predetermined conclusions while creating the appearance of legitimate investigation. What about the children who might be in danger right now? If that laboratory is still operational, there could be victims who need immediate rescue. "Ms. Blackthorne," Whitmore said with practiced patience, "your claims about operational facilities are clearly the result of stress and imagination. There are no children in danger. There is no active conspiracy. There are simply historical allegations that deserve proper scholarly examination." But Diana could see doubt creeping into Officer Chen's expression as she processed the implications of a preserved laboratory. Even if Chen couldn't act officially due to her suspension, she was clearly planning to take some form of action. Eleanor seemed to reach the same conclusion.
Officer Chen, regardless of your employment status, you took an oath to protect and serve. Sometimes that oath requires actions that go beyond official policy. Diana understood what Eleanor was suggesting. If the official system was too corrupted to provide justice, they might need to pursue justice through unofficial channels. Officer Chen, Sisser, I think you're right that this situation requires immediate action, but it needs to be the right kind of action taken by people with proper authority. What if the people with proper authority are the ones perpetrating the crimes? It was the question that exposed the fundamental problem they faced. In a system where corruption reached to the highest levels, normal legal processes became tools of oppression rather than justice. Diana made a decision that would either save their lives or cost them everything. Officer Chen, she said loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, I'm officially reporting that I have direct knowledge of an active crime scene containing evidence of multiple homicides, and I'm willing to testify on oath about what I've discovered. I'm also reporting that members of the Ravenshollow city government and police department are actively obstructing investigation of these crimes. The formal nature of her statement changed the legal dynamics in the room. Diana had just created an official record that would have to be addressed through proper channels, regardless of who wanted to suppress it. Chief Aldrich's face darkened with anger. Ms. Blackthorne, filing false reports is a felony offense. Then investigate my claims and prove they're false. Examine the underground laboratory. Review the evidence Eleanor has preserved. Interview the families of the 43 children who disappeared. If I'm lying, it should be easy to prove. Whitmore's patience finally snapped completely. Enough, he said with cold finality. This charade has gone on long enough. He nodded to his associates, who moved to positions blocking the cottage's exits. Diana realized that the pretense of legality was over. Whatever happened next would be decisive and permanent. But Officer Chen had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment. As Whitmore's men moved to control the room, she activated her radio with a prearranged signal. All units, Officer Chen reporting active threat to civilians at 47 Woodland Court, requesting immediate backup for protective custody situation, multiple suspects armed and dangerous. Chief Aldrich lunged for Chen's radio, but she was younger and faster. Officer Chen, you're under arrest for filing false reports and interfering with official investigations. Chief, my radio transmission was heard by dispatch and multiple units. The state police have also been monitoring our frequency tonight. This situation is now officially beyond local control.
Diana felt a surge of hope as she realized that Officer Chen had been playing a longer game than anyone had suspected. She'd been documenting the corruption and building a case for outside intervention. But Whitmore wasn't finished. Officer Chen, he said with deadly calm, I think you'll find that your career in law enforcement is over, regardless of how tonight ends. And careers aren't the only things that can end unexpectedly. Mr. Whitmore, Chen replied steadily, that sounds like a threat against a police officer, made in front of multiple witnesses. I'm placing you under arrest. As Chen moved to handcuff Whitmore, his associate stepped forward to intervene. Diana realized that the careful balance of power that had maintained the conspiracy for 50 years was about to collapse into open violence. The sirens in the distance weren't from local police anymore. They were from state units responding to Officer Chen's call. Help was coming, but Diana wasn't sure they would survive long enough to receive it. The game of cat and mouse was over. Now it was a fight for survival, with the evidence of 50-year-old crimes as the prize that would determine whether justice would finally prevail or whether the conspiracy would claim 3 more victims to protect its secrets. As Whitmore's men moved to overpower Officer Chen, Diana clutched Eleanor's evidence folder and prepared to defend the truth with her life. The cottage erupted into chaos as Whitmore's men moved to overpower Officer Chen. Diana clutched Eleanor's evidence folder and pressed herself against the wall, watching the careful facade of civilized discourse collapse into desperate violence. Chen was well trained, but she was outnumbered and caught off guard by the sudden escalation. Stay back,
Chen shouted, drawing her service weapon as the first of Whitmore's associates reached for her. "I will use force to defend myself and these civilians." Chief Aldrich drew his own weapon, pointing it directly at Chen. "Officer Chen, you're relieved of duty and under arrest. Drop your weapon immediately." Diana realized she was witnessing the complete breakdown of law and order in Ravenshollow. The corruption wasn't just about covering up historical crimes, it was about maintaining a system where certain people operated above the law entirely. Eleanor, despite her age, moved with surprising agility toward the cottage's kitchen. "Diana," she called, "the back door! We need to reach the state police before they silence us permanently." But Whitmore anticipated their escape attempt. "Gentlemen," he said calmly to his associates, "secure all exits. No one leaves this cottage until we've resolved our communication problem." Diana understood the euphemism. Their communication problem would be resolved by ensuring no one survived to communicate anything. That's when the sound they'd all been waiting for finally arrived. Multiple sirens, approaching rapidly from different directions. But instead of relief, Diana felt a new surge of fear as she realized the first responders might not be allies. "State police," Chen said with grim satisfaction. "My radio call triggered an automatic notification to the state when I reported threats against civilians in an active crime scene." Through the cottage windows, Diana could see multiple vehicles arriving, not just the black SUVs of Whitmore's people, or the familiar Ravenshollow police cruisers, but unmarked sedans and vehicles with state police markings. "Mr. Whitmore," Chief Aldrich said urgently, "we need to contain this situation before state investigators become involved." "Too late for that," Chen replied. "My radio transmissions have been recorded. The state police have jurisdiction over any crimes involving local law enforcement corruption." Whitmore's expression revealed the calculating mind that had maintained this conspiracy for decades. "Officer Chen, I think you're overestimating the state police's interest in pursuing allegations based on the testimony of mentally unstable individuals and forged documents." "The documents aren't forged," Eleanor said firmly, "and I'm not mentally unstable. I'm a retired nurse with 40 years of medical expertise who has preserved evidence of systematic child murder." "Mrs. Hartwell," Whitmore replied with practiced patience, "your late husband's psychiatric breakdown in the 1970s is well documented. His paranoid delusions about hospital conspiracies led to his professional censure and medical license revocation. It's tragic that those delusions have influenced your perception of events." "You destroyed his career because he threatened to expose your crimes," Eleanor shot back. "James was brilliant and ethical. You ruined him to protect your conspiracy."
Mrs. Hartwell, there is no conspiracy. There never was. Your husband suffered from early-onset dementia that manifested as paranoid delusions about his colleagues. The medical board acted appropriately to protect patients from a physician whose judgment had been compromised. Diana realized she was witnessing the same gaslighting techniques that had been used for 50 years to discredit anyone who threatened the conspiracy. By attacking the mental health and credibility of witnesses, the conspirators could dismiss any evidence as the product of unstable minds. A sharp knock on the cottage door interrupted the standoff. "State police, open immediately!" Officer Chen moved toward the door, but Chief Aldrich blocked her path. "I'll handle this," he said. "This is still a local matter until determined otherwise." "Chief," Chen replied steadily, "you've already demonstrated that local authority has been compromised. The state police have jurisdiction." As Aldrich opened the door, Diana could see 3 state police investigators in professional suits, flanked by uniformed officers. The lead investigator was a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with complex criminal cases. "I'm Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, State Police Criminal Investigation Division," she announced, displaying her credentials. "We're responding to reports of threats against civilians and potential obstruction of justice by local law enforcement." Chief Aldrich attempted to maintain control of the situation. "Inspector Morrison, There's been a misunderstanding. We have two distressed individuals making wild allegations based on fabricated evidence. Officer Chen has exceeded her authority and been suspended for insubordination." Detective Inspector Morrison's gaze swept the room, taking in the positioning of all parties, the drawn weapons, and the obvious tension. "I see. And the nature of these wild allegations?" Diana stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "Inspector Morrison, I've discovered evidence of systematic child murder at the Thornfield Estate, dating from 1973 to 1975. There's an underground laboratory that's been preserved in operational condition for 50 years, and I believe children may still be at risk." Morrison's expression sharpened with professional interest. "That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have?" Diana held up Eleanor's folder. "Medical records, death certificates, correspondence between conspirators, and photographs documenting experimental procedures on children, plus physical evidence at the estate itself." "Inspector Morrison," Whitmore interjected smoothly, "Miss Blackthorne is facing foreclosure and made an impulsive property purchase based on conspiracy theories promoted by Mrs. Hartwell, whose late husband suffered from documented psychiatric issues. The evidence consists of materials that have been repeatedly debunked by qualified experts." "What experts? When was this evidence examined? By whom?" Diana felt a surge of hope as she realized that Morrison was asking the same questions she'd asked, questions that revealed the holes in Whitmore's narrative. "The Trust's legal team has reviewed these materials multiple times over the years. Mrs. Hartwell has attempted to promote these allegations on several occasions, and each time they've been determined to be either forgeries or materials taken out of context." "I'd like to examine this evidence myself. Mrs. Hartwell, may I see the documents you've preserved?" Eleanor handed over the folder with obvious relief. "Inspector Morrison, everything in there is authentic. My husband risked his life to preserve that evidence because he knew the truth would eventually surface." As Morrison reviewed the documents, her expression grew increasingly serious. Diana watched Whitmore's confidence waver as the state investigator examined materials that had never actually been debunked by any qualified experts. "These appear to be genuine medical records and correspondence. The letterheads are period-appropriate. The handwriting analysis would need laboratory confirmation, but the documentation is remarkably detailed and internally consistent." "Inspector Morrison," Chief Aldrich interjected, "you're looking at materials that have been in the possession of individuals with documented psychiatric issues for 50 years. There's no chain of custody, no authentication, no verification of their source." "That's exactly why we need to examine the physical location Ms. Blackthorne mentioned. If there's an underground laboratory at the Thornfield Estate, that would provide independent verification of these allegations." Diana felt the momentum shifting in their favor, but Whitmore wasn't finished. "Inspector Morrison, the Thornfield Estate is private property currently involved in complex legal proceedings. Any search would require proper warrants and consideration of property rights." "Mr. Whitmore, if children are potentially at risk, property rights become secondary to public safety. Ms. Blackthorne, you mentioned the laboratory appears to be maintained in operational condition?" "Yes," Diana replied firmly. "The equipment is functional, the lights work, everything has been preserved as if someone intended to use it again. It's not a historical artifact, it's an active facility." Morrison turned to her colleagues. "We need immediate backup and a search team. If there's any possibility that children are currently in danger, we have exigent circumstances that override normal warrant requirements." Diana realized that the mention of potentially ongoing crimes had shifted the legal framework entirely. The state police couldn't ignore claims about children in immediate danger, regardless of property rights or local political considerations. Inspector Morrison, Whitmore said with obvious frustration, you're allowing yourself to be manipulated by individuals with clear psychiatric and financial motivations. There are no children in danger, there is no active facility, there are simply historical allegations being promoted by unstable people. Then you won't object to a search that will quickly disprove these allegations? Morrison replied. Mr. Whitmore, I understand you have family connections to the property. Will you cooperate with our investigation? The question was phrased as a request, but Diana could hear the steel underneath. Morrison was giving Whitmore an opportunity to cooperate or be treated as an obstruction to the investigation. Whitmore's response revealed the desperation beneath his composed exterior. Inspector Morrison, I think you'll find that your career advancement depends on your ability to distinguish between legitimate investigations and witch hunts based on fabricated evidence. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison's jaw tightened with anger at the attempted intimidation. Mr. Whitmore, that sounds suspiciously like an attempt to influence a state police investigation. Are you threatening an officer in the performance of her duties? I'm simply reminding you that actions have consequences, and that some investigations can damage the careers of the investigators more than their targets. Officer Chen stepped forward. Inspector Morrison, Mr. Whitmore has been making similar threats all evening. I have his previous statements recorded, including threats against civilians and law enforcement officers. Diana remembered Eleanor's hidden recording device and realized they had documented evidence of Whitmore's intimidation tactics. Mrs. Hartwell, Morrison said, I understand you have recordings of tonight's events. Eleanor produced the small device from the hollowed-out atlas. Everything from the moment they entered my cottage, threats, admissions, attempts to suppress evidence, it's all documented. Morrison accepted the recording device with professional satisfaction. This will be entered into evidence and analyzed by our forensics team. In the meantime, we're proceeding with an immediate search of the Thornfield Estate. You'll need a warrant, Chief Aldrich protested. You can't search private property based on the ravings of mentally unstable individuals. Chief Aldrich, Morrison replied coldly, I have credible reports of children in immediate danger, documented evidence of systematic crimes, and recorded threats against witnesses and law enforcement. That constitutes exigent circumstances that override normal warrant requirements. Diana felt a surge of hope as she realized that the conspiracy's greatest strength, its ability to control local institutions, had become its greatest weakness. The state police operated outside Ravenshallow's power structure and weren't susceptible to the same corruption. Inspector Morrison, she said urgently, there's something else you need to know. The underground laboratory isn't the only location involved. Mrs. Hartwell has a map showing at least 3 other properties that were connected to the original crimes. Eleanor produced the hand-drawn map James Hartwell had created. My husband identified multiple sites where children were held, experimented on, and disposed of. The Thornfield Estate was just the primary research facility. Morrison studied the map with growing alarm. These are all current addresses in Ravenshallow's most exclusive neighborhoods. Are you saying this network extended to multiple properties? The conspiracy involved dozens of people. Doctors, hospital administrators, business leaders, city officials. It was a systematic criminal enterprise that generated substantial profits for its participants. Profits from what? Diana answered. From research results to pharmaceutical companies and government agencies. The children weren't just victims, they were products in a research and development program. Morrison's expression hardened with professional outrage. We're not talking about historical crimes. If this research generated ongoing profits, there could be continued criminal activity connected to the original conspiracy. Whitmore's careful composure finally cracked completely. This is madness. You're destroying the reputations of respected families based on the delusions of mentally ill people and forged documents. Mr. Whitmore, Morrison replied with icy calm,
If the allegations are false, our investigation will quickly determine that. If they're true, then respected families have been covering up child murder for 50 years. Either way, the truth needs to be established through proper investigation, not intimidation and suppression. Diana realized that Whitmore's greatest mistake had been underestimating how his threats and intimidation tactics would appear to outside investigators. By trying to control the situation through force, he'd actually validated the allegations he was trying to suppress. "Inspector Morrison," Officer Chen said, "I request permission to accompany your search team to the Thornfield Estate. I'm familiar with the property layout and can guide you to the underground laboratory." "Permission granted. Chief Aldrich, your department will cooperate fully with our investigation, or I'll be requesting a federal review of local law enforcement practices." Chief Aldrich's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Inspector Morrison, you're making a serious mistake. The political ramifications of this investigation will extend far beyond Ravenshollow." "Chief, my concern is with criminal ramifications, not political ones. If powerful people have been committing crimes, their power doesn't protect them from investigation."
Diana felt the room's energy shift as the balance of power completed its reversal. The conspiracy that had seemed omnipotent an hour ago was now facing genuine law enforcement investigation for the first time in 50 years. "Inspector Morrison," Eleanor said quietly, "there's one more thing you should know. James hid additional evidence in multiple locations around Ravenshollow. Even if something happens to what we've shared tonight, other copies exist." "Where are these additional copies?" Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "Safe deposit boxes in 3 different banks, with instructions for release to federal authorities if anything happens to me. Legal offices in 2 different states, with sealed envelopes containing copies of all documents, and with trusted individuals who have instructions to contact federal authorities if James's evidence is ever needed." Diana realized that Eleanor and her late husband had created a fail-safe system that made suppressing the evidence impossible. Even if the conspiracy eliminated all current witnesses, the truth would still surface through multiple independent channels. Whitmore stared at Eleanor with something approaching respect mixed with hatred. "You've been planning this for 50 years. James and I promised those murdered children that justice would eventually be served. It took 50 years, but promises to the dead are sacred obligations." Inspector Morrison coordinated with her team via radio, arranging for additional investigators, forensic specialists, and search equipment to be dispatched to the Thornfield Estate immediately. The operation was escalating from a simple investigation to a major crime scene examination. "Miss Blackthorne, I'll need you to provide a detailed statement about everything you discovered at the estate. Mrs. Hartwell, your husband's documentation will require extensive analysis, but it appears to be the most comprehensive evidence we've ever seen regarding these allegations." Diana felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as she realized that the nightmare was finally ending. The truth about Thornfield Estate would emerge, the conspiracy would be exposed, and justice would be served for 43 children who'd been murdered and forgotten. But Whitmore had one final card to play. "Inspector Morrison," he said with renewed confidence, "before you proceed with this investigation, I think you should know that the Whitmore family has maintained extensive documentation of our own regarding these allegations. We've been investigating them internally for years, and our findings will interest you." Diana felt her heart sink as she realized that Whitmore was attempting to control the narrative even now, probably planning to release a version of the truth that minimized his family's involvement while appearing to cooperate with the investigation. "What sort of documentation?" Morrison asked skeptically. financial records showing payments made to victims' families over the years as compassionate assistance, correspondence with law enforcement agencies regarding our concerns about Dr. Ashford's activities, evidence that the Whitmore family actually helped expose and stop the original crimes. It was a masterful attempt at revisionist history, by claiming to have been secret opponents of the conspiracy rather than participants. Whitmore was trying to position his family as heroes rather than villains. "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said with steel in her voice, "your family didn't oppose Edmund Ashford. You funded him. You participated in selecting victims. You helped dispose of the bodies. And you've spent 50 years profiting from research developed through child murder." "Mrs. Hartwell, you're confused about the chronology and the participants. The Whitmore family's involvement was always focused on stopping the crimes and protecting the community from further harm." Diana watched this battle over historical truth with fascination and horror. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, Whitmore was attempting to rewrite 50 years of carefully documented criminal activity. Inspector Morrison cut through the competing narratives with professional directness. "Gentlemen, ladies, the truth will be determined through proper investigation, not through competing claims. We'll examine all evidence, interview all witnesses, and let the facts speak for themselves." As Morrison's team prepared to move to the Thornfield Estate, Diana realized that the most important phase of the investigation was just beginning. The underground laboratory would either validate everything she'd discovered or reveal her to be the victim of an elaborate deception. But as they prepared to leave Eleanor's cottage, Diana caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Through the window, she could see lights moving in the direction of the Thornfield Estate. Someone was there ahead of them, and it wasn't hard to guess what they were doing. "Inspector Morrison," Diana called urgently, "there are lights at the estate. Someone is there right now, probably destroying evidence." Morrison immediately radioed her team. "All units, proceed to target location immediately. Suspect evidence destruction in progress. Secure all access points and prevent anyone from leaving the property."
Her phone remained useless, the estate's isolation now feeling less like a quirk of geography and more like a carefully engineered trap. But Diana's professional experience had taught her that old houses always offered multiple escape routes: servants' stairs, back entrances, delivery passages designed to keep staff movements invisible to the main household. Moving as quietly as possible, Diana slipped behind the library's massive desk and found what she'd hoped for: a second door, partially concealed behind floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The brass handle turned silently, revealing a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway. The servants' passage was dimly lit by small windows that faced the estate's rear grounds. Diana could see dense woods extending beyond the manicured lawn. If she could reach the tree line, she might be able to circle back to her car or find another way to call for help. As she moved through the passage, Diana's mind churned over the implications of what she'd discovered. The underground laboratory wasn't just evidence of past crimes. It was proof of an ongoing conspiracy that reached into Ravenshallow's current power structure. Robert Whitmore hadn't simply inherited knowledge of his father's involvement, he'd actively maintained the cover-up for decades. The passage ended at a service entrance near the estate's kitchen. Through the small window, Diana could see that the rear grounds were empty. Whitmore's men had focused their initial search on the main house. But her Honda was parked in the front drive, surrounded by their vehicles. Diana eased the service door open and slipped outside into the cold November air. The storm was intensifying, providing natural cover as she moved along the estate's perimeter toward the woods. Her professional clothes, a wool blazer and dress pants, were wholly inadequate for outdoor escape, but desperation provided its own insulation against the cold. Behind her, she could hear voices calling her name from inside the house. They discovered her absence and would begin expanding their search momentarily. Diana reached the tree line just as flashlight beams began sweeping the rear grounds. The woods were dense and unforgiving, full of hidden roots and low branches that caught at her clothing. But they also offered concealment and, she hoped, an alternative route back to the main road. Diana had noticed during her drive that Morning Dove Lane curved around a substantial wooded area. If she could navigate through the trees, she might emerge at a point where she could flag down passing traffic. As she stumbled through the underbrush, Diana's mind raced over what she'd learned. 43 children had disappeared into Dr. Ashford's facility between 1973 and 1975. Their personal belongings remained in that underground chamber like memorial artifacts. And Ravenshallow's power structure had not only covered up these crimes, but had actively profited from maintaining the conspiracy. The real estate transaction that had seemed like her salvation was actually an elaborate trap. Marianne Whitmore had specifically targeted Diana because of her financial desperation, knowing that a struggling business owner would be willing to overlook the unusual terms of sale. They needed someone to purchase the property legitimately, probably to satisfy legal requirements for the trust's liquidation, but they'd also needed to control what that person discovered. The question was whether they'd planned to simply buy her silence or if they'd intended something more permanent from the beginning. Diana had been walking for nearly 20 minutes when she heard the sound that chilled her to the bone. Dogs barking. Not the playful yapping of family pets, but the deep, purposeful baying of hunting dogs following a scent trail. They hadn't just come prepared to intimidate her into silence. They'd come equipped to hunt her down if she ran. Panic gave Diana a speed she didn't know she possessed. She crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about stealth, focused only on reaching the road before the dogs found her trail. Behind her, the barking grew louder and more excited as the animals picked up her scent. The trees began to thin, and Diana could see the gray ribbon of asphalt through the branches. But as she emerged from the woods onto Morning Dove Lane, her heart sank. 2 more black SUVs were parked along the road, their occupants clearly positioned to intercept anyone attempting to flee the estate. Diana was completely surrounded. She ducked back into the tree line, mind racing through increasingly desperate options. The dogs were closer now, their handlers' voices carrying through the storm. In minutes, they would have her cornered with nowhere left to run. That's when Diana noticed something she'd missed during her panicked flight. The woods weren't as isolated as they appeared. Through the trees, she could see the lights of a house, not one of the massive estates on Millionaire's Row, but a modest cottage that seemed to belong to a different era of Ravenshallow's development. The cottage was her only hope. Diana fought her way through the remaining trees toward the distant lights, thorns tearing at her clothes and branches whipping across her face. The dogs were close enough now that she could hear their panting between barks. Her professional high heels had long since become a liability. She kicked them off and continued barefoot across the frozen ground. The cottage's backyard was separated from the woods by a low stone wall that Diana scaled with desperation-fueled agility. She pounded on the back door, praying that whoever lived here would be willing to help a stranger in obvious distress.
Additional reports began flooding in as the coordinated raids succeeded across Ravenshollow. The private medical facility yielded more evidence and 2 additional adults in custody. The property with the crematorium revealed horrific evidence of body disposal spanning decades, but no current victims. By dawn, the scope of the investigation had expanded to include federal authorities, child protective services, and a media presence that would ensure the story couldn't be suppressed or forgotten. Diana found herself at the center of what was being called the largest child trafficking and abuse case in New England history. "Ms. Blackthorne," Inspector Morrison said as the initial crisis phase concluded, "I want you to know that your actions tonight saved lives. Those 7 children we recovered might have become the next generation of victims if you hadn't been brave enough to report what you discovered." Diana looked out at the estate where it all began, now swarming with investigators documenting 50 years of systematic crimes. The mansion was damaged but not destroyed. Enough evidence remained to tell the story of what had happened within its walls. "What happens now?" Diana asked. "Now comes the hardest part," Morrison replied. "Building criminal cases that will stand up in court, caring for the survivors, and ensuring that justice is finally served for all the victims, past and present." Eleanor, who had remained silent during the rescue operations, finally spoke. "James would be proud," she said quietly. "He always believed the truth would surface eventually. It just took 50 years and the right person to find it." Diana thought about the brass key she discovered beneath the floorboards, the key that had unlocked not just hidden doors, but hidden truths that powerful people had spent decades keeping buried. Her desperate attempt to save her failing business had become something far more important, a catalyst for justice that had been delayed, but not ultimately denied. In the months that followed, Diana would testify in trials that dismantled Ravenshollow's power structure and sent dozens of conspirators to prison. The 7 rescued children would receive the care and protection they needed to heal from their trauma. And the memory of 43 children who had died in the 1970s would finally be honored with the justice they deserved. The Thornfield Estate, once a symbol of hidden horror, was eventually converted into a memorial and research center dedicated to protecting children and preventing such crimes from ever happening again. Diana's inheritance, which had seemed like a burden, became the foundation for ensuring that the truth would never again be buried beneath carefully maintained lies. As she stood on the estate grounds 1 year later, watching children play safely in what had once been a place of unimaginable suffering, Diana reflected on how a single decision to investigate rather than ignore had changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries come disguised as the worst possible luck, and sometimes the courage to seek truth, even when it's dangerous and unwelcome, is the only thing standing between justice and its continued denial. The key Diana had found had unlocked more than hidden doors. It had unlocked the possibility for healing, justice, and hope, where once there had only been carefully preserved horror. And in that transformation, she found a purpose far more valuable than any financial salvation she could have imagined.